The wind was blowing hard across the wide-open land of Montana. It was the kind of night when the sky seemed endless, dark like ink, and the sound of the wind carried far over the empty fields. The old wooden fence outside the house creaked, and the tall grass bowed down with every strong gust. Snow had started to fall not in a gentle way, but in thick, heavy flakes that stuck to the windows and covered everything like a white blanket. Inside the small ranch house, the air was warm from the old iron stove that burned slowly in the corner. A kettle whistled softly on the stove, filling the room with a light sound that mixed with the wind outside. Jack sat by the kitchen table with a heavy wool jacket still on his shoulders. He was a tall man with rough, hard-working hands, the kind of hands that had lifted heavy bales of hay, fixed fences, and cared for animals his entire life. Jack wasn't the kind of man who talked a lot, but everything about him showed his strength. His face was calm, but his eyes were full of quiet worry. Across the hallway in a small bedroom lay Mary, his wife of more than 40 years. She was the soft voice in the house, the gentle laugh that made the long winters bearable, the hands that had made this ranch a home. But tonight Mary's laughter was gone. For days she had been feeling weak. At first she thought it was just a cold. She had wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and insisted she was fine, the way she always did. But by the third day the cough had become heavier. Her skin had turned pale and her breathing grew short and uneven. Jack had begged her to let him drive her to town, but the storm came early that year. The roads were blocked with snow. The phone lines had fallen, and the nearest hospital was many miles away. Jack checked on her again and again. Each time the room felt colder, though the fire kept burning. The small lamp by the bed cast a golden glow on her face. Mary lay propped up on a few pillows, her hair messy from the restless nights, her eyes half open. Her breathing made a soft sound, like someone struggling to climb a hill. She tried to smile when she saw Jack walk in. Jack pulled a chair close to the bed and took her hand. Her fingers felt cold against his warm, rough skin. He rubbed them gently, hoping the warmth from his hands would bring her some comfort. "I'm here," he whispered, not sure what else to say. Mary nodded weakly, her lips trembling from the effort of even the smallest movement. The wind outside grew louder, hitting the side of the house like waves hitting rocks. Jack could hear the horses moving restlessly in the barn. Even the animals could feel that something was wrong. He checked the thermometer they kept on the wall. The temperature outside was dropping fast. He thought about starting the truck, but he already knew it wouldn't start in this kind of cold. And even if it did, the roads were gone under the snow. Jack walked back to Mary's bedside. She looked so small under the thick quilt she had sewn herself years ago. The pattern of tiny flowers was faded, but it was still warm. She had wrapped that same quilt around their children when they were little. She had wrapped it around Jack when he came home tired from the fields. And now Jack tucked it around her like it was the only thing he could do to protect her. Mary's breathing suddenly hitched. She opened her eyes wider and whispered, barely audible, "Jack." He leaned closer. Her voice was thin and shaky. "I won't make it through the night," she whispered. Her eyes glistened in the dim light. There was no fear in her tone, only quiet acceptance, like she was too tired to keep fighting. For a moment, everything around Jack seemed to stop. The wind, the ticking of the clock on the wall, even his heartbeat felt distant. The words sank into him slowly, like cold water creeping into his boots on a winter day. But Jack wasn't the kind of man to give up. He held her hand tighter. "Don't say that," he said softly, trying to keep his voice steady. "We've made it through worse. We'll make it through this too." Mary gave him a weak smile, the kind that broke his heart a little more. "You've always been strong," she whispered, "but this storm is stronger than both of us." Jack shook his head. "No," he said, firmer now. "Nothing's stronger than us." He looked into her tired eyes, remembering all the nights they had faced together. Nights when the roof almost flew off in storms. Nights when the cattle got sick and they worked until sunrise. Nights when they had no money but still found a way to laugh over a pot of soup. This was their life. Hard but beautiful, full of love that held everything together. Mary closed her eyes slowly. Her breathing was shallow, but she was still listening. Jack brushed a loose strand of hair from her forehead. He could feel the heat of her fever even without touching. He wanted to call for help, to scream at the storm, to do something, anything to fix this. But all he could do at that moment was stay by her side. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a pot of warm water and soaked a cloth in it. He placed the warm cloth on her forehead, then wrapped another around her hands. "You're going to be fine," he whispered again, as if repeating it could make it true. The house felt smaller as the night deepened. Shadows danced on the walls from the flickering lamp. Outside, the storm had no mercy. Snow piled against the door. The old clock struck 11, and each sound echoed through the house like a reminder that time was passing. Jack walked to the window and looked out. All he could see was white. The world had disappeared under a sheet of snow. The fence, the barn, even the road that led to town had vanished. It was just him, Mary, and the storm. He remembered the day they bought this ranch together. It had been nothing but dry land and broken wood, but Mary had seen something special in it. She had painted the walls herself, planted flowers by the porch, and turned it into a home. Jack had built every fence post with his own hands. They had raised their children here, watched sunsets together, and built a life they were proud of. Jack turned away from the window and went back to Mary's side. He wasn't a man of many words, but he knew love wasn't about speeches. It was about staying, and that was what he was going to do. Stay. Mary opened her eyes again, weak but still shining with something familiar. "Do you remember the spring dance?" she whispered. Jack's heart softened. "I remember," he said. It was the night he had asked her to marry him, under a string of fairy lights at the town's little fairground. She had worn a blue dress, and he had been so nervous he nearly forgot the ring. She had said yes, laughing the way only she could. Mary gave a faint smile, as if that memory warmed her a little. "You stepped on my foot the whole night," she said in a whisper. Jack laughed softly. "I still can't dance," he admitted. She squeezed his hand weakly. "But you've always known how to hold on." Those words settled into Jack like a promise. He wouldn't let go, not now, not tonight. He checked the stove again, fed it more wood, and made sure the house stayed warm. He carried in another quilt from the closet and tucked it around her shoulders. He sat back down beside her and began to tell her stories, the kind they used to tell their children on cold nights. He talked about the time they got lost on a trail and found their way home by following the stars. He talked about the summer their son caught his first horse. He talked about the little things that made their life feel big. As he spoke, Mary's breathing remained uneven, but a small, soft smile stayed on her face. She was tired, he could see it, but she was still here, still fighting. Jack didn't know what the night would bring, but as the storm roared and the world outside disappeared under the snow, one thing was clear in his heart. He would not let her face the night alone. He leaned close, kissed her forehead gently, and whispered, "We've got this, Mary. We always do." And with that, the old ranch house stood strong against the storm. Warm light glowing softly inside, two hearts holding on to each other, refusing to let go. The night grew colder as the wind kept blowing across the wide, open land. Snow continued to fall heavily, making the windows rattle softly with each strong gust. The house felt smaller with every passing minute, as if the storm outside was pressing closer and closer. Jack sat beside Mary's bed, holding her hand, feeling every slight tremble in her fingers. Her breathing had not improved. If anything, it had become slower, softer, like a whisper almost lost in the night. He looked at the clock. It was past midnight. The world outside their little ranch was silent except for the howling wind. The roads were buried. The phone lines were still dead. He knew no help would come through that storm. Not tonight. If Mary was going to make it, it would have to be because he didn't give up. Jack got up quietly and checked the wood stove again. The fire was still burning, but the heat was starting to fade. He added more logs and watched the flames grow taller. The light danced across the room, making the shadows on the walls move like waves. He rubbed his hands together, trying to gather some warmth before walking back to the bedroom. Mary's lips were dry and her forehead was warm. Jack brought a glass of water to her lips, tilting it gently so she could take small sips. "Just a little," he whispered. She opened her eyes weakly and obeyed, her hand still holding his. Her skin felt so fragile under his rough palms, a reminder of how strong she had been all these years and how delicate she was now. Jack sat down again, thinking of what he could do. The hospital was more than 20 miles away. Even if the truck started, he couldn't make it through the snowed-in roads. The storm was getting worse, not better. The wind sounded like a living thing outside, steady, strong, and cold. He thought about the radio. Years ago, when the kids were young, they had an old battery radio for emergencies. He jumped up, went to the small closet in the hallway and pulled out a dusty box. Inside, under some old tools, was the little black radio. The batteries were weak, but it still made a soft crackling sound when he turned it on. Jack turned the dial slowly, moving through static and broken voices, hoping to catch something. A weather update. A warning. A sound from anyone. Finally, through the static, a voice came through faintly, talking about the storm. Roads were closed. Emergency services were delayed. The wind chill was dangerously low. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the reality sink in. They were truly alone out here. But Jack wasn't the kind of man who gave up when things got hard. The ranch had taught him that. Storms, floods, sick animals, broken fences. He had faced all of it, and he had always found a way. And tonight he needed to find a way again. Not for the ranch, but for Mary. He grabbed his thick winter coat from the hook by the door. The fabric was stiff and cold, but it had kept him warm on many winter nights. He pulled on his boots, wrapping an extra scarf around his neck. When he came back to Mary's side, she opened her eyes slowly. "Jack, where are you going?" she whispered weakly. "I'm not going far," he said softly, kneeling beside her. "I just need to make sure everything's ready." "You're going to be all right, Mary. I promise you." She tried to smile, but it came out faint, almost invisible. "You've always been stubborn," she whispered, a little spark of their old humor showing through the weakness. Jack smiled softly. "And you've always loved that about me," he said. She gave a tiny nod, then closed her eyes again. Jack walked to the door and stepped outside. The wind hit him instantly, freezing the air in his lungs. The snow was deep, rising almost to his knees. The sky was a dark gray, heavy with more snow waiting to fall. He could barely see the barn a short distance away. He took a deep breath, pulled his hat lower over his ears, and started walking toward the barn. Every step was heavy. The snow was thick and the wind pushed against him like it wanted to stop him from moving. But Jack had walked through worse. He kept his eyes fixed on the dim shape of the barn ahead. When he reached the barn doors, he pushed them open slowly. The warm breath of the horses filled the air inside. They were restless, shifting their hooves, their ears flicking at every sound of the storm. They could sense something wasn't right. Jack walked up to his oldest and strongest horse, a brown mare named Daisy. She had been with them for many years, gentle and brave. Jack ran a hand down her neck. "Hey girl," he whispered, "we might need you tonight." He gave her some hay and checked her saddle. It was old but strong. If the worst came to worst, he would have to get Mary out on horseback. He didn't know if it was possible in this storm, but he needed to be ready. Jack checked the generator too. It was in the shed next to the barn. He wiped the snow off and pulled the cord. It sputtered weakly but didn't start. He tried again. It coughed and then fell silent. Jack clenched his jaw. He didn't say a word, just kept trying. On the fourth pull, it made a soft rumble, but it was uneven. It wouldn't last long. The generator powered Mary's oxygen machine. If it failed, she'd have only her strength left. And right now, she didn't have much. Jack adjusted the fuel line, tapped the side, and whispered a small prayer. Something simple, something quiet. Finally, the generator caught and gave a low hum. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough for now. Jack stood there for a moment, letting the sound give him a little bit of hope. He trudged back to the house through the thick snow. His coat was covered in white, his hands red from the cold. When he opened the door, the warm air from inside hit him like a soft wave. Mary was still awake, her eyes half open. He knelt beside her again. "The generator's working," he said softly. "You'll get your air. And Daisy's ready if we need to go." Mary blinked slowly. "Always ready," she whispered. Jack squeezed her hand gently.
He could feel how weak she was.
Her breathing had become more shallow, each inhale shorter than the one before. He could hear the quiet sound of the oxygen machine. It wasn't strong, but it was enough to keep her going for now. He sat down again, but he didn't let go of her hand. He remembered all the nights she had stayed up with him when he was sick. The way she used to hum soft songs when the kids had fevers. She had always been the strong one when someone needed her. And now it was his turn to be strong for her. Outside, the storm kept growing. Snow piled higher against the windows. The roof creaked gently under the weight. Jack kept checking the lamp, making sure they had enough oil. He listened for any strange sound from the generator. He was tired, but he didn't let himself rest. "Not tonight," Mary whispered something. Jack leaned closer to hear her. "Remember the apple tree?" she asked weakly. He smiled softly. Of course he remembered. The apple tree had been the first thing they planted together after they bought the ranch. It was just a tiny sapling then. Over the years it had grown tall and wide, shading their porch in summer. Their children had climbed it. Mary had baked hundreds of pies with its fruit, I remember, Jack said softly. You wouldn't let me cut it down even when it stopped giving apples. She gave the tiniest smile. Because it was ours, she whispered. Jack felt his throat tighten. Even in this moment, she was thinking about the little things that made their life special. He kissed her forehead gently. We'll sit under it again, he whispered. You and me. She didn't answer, but her hand squeezed his faintly. Jack spent the next hour moving quietly around the house, checking everything, keeping the warmth steady. He looked at the photographs on the wall, pictures of their children, their wedding day, summer picnics, birthdays. This house wasn't just wood and nails. It was their history. It was everything they had built together. And as the night grew longer and colder, Jack made himself a quiet promise. He would not let her slip away. Not while he still had breath in his body. Not while the fire still burned in their home. He sat back down beside her, gently rubbing her hands to keep them warm. She drifted in and out of sleep, her breaths uneven but steady enough to give him hope. The storm roared outside, but inside Jack stayed strong like a wall holding back the world. He didn't know what the next hour would bring. But he knew this, he was not going to stop fighting for her. The wind outside grew louder, as if the night itself had a voice. The snow kept falling, piling higher against the sides of the little ranch house. The trees in the distance bent low under the weight of the storm, and the world seemed to disappear into a blur of white and darkness. Inside, the soft hum of the old generator and the quiet crackle of the fire were the only sounds keeping the house alive. Jack sat next to Mary, watching her breathe. Each breath was short and shallow. Her lips were pale, her cheeks no longer carried their usual warm glow. He could hear the faint sound of her trying to draw air in, and it made his heart ache. She had always been so strong, the woman who could work on the ranch from sunrise to sunset, who could bake bread while the wind shook the windows, who had held their family together through every season. But now, lying there wrapped in quilts, she looked so fragile. Jack leaned closer and whispered, "Stay with me, Mary. Please stay with me." She opened her eyes slowly. Her voice was no more than a soft breath. "I'm tired, Jack," she whispered. "I'm so tired." Jack swallowed hard. His hands tightened around hers, but gently, careful not to hurt her. "I know you are," he said softly. "But don't give up on me now. We've come too far." She looked at him, and for a moment, there was a spark. That same spark he saw when she laughed on summer days, when she danced with him in the kitchen, when she held their children in her arms. But the spark was faint now, like a small candle struggling against the wind. Jack stood up and walked to the window. He pulled the curtain aside and looked out. The snow was nearly up to the porch steps. The wind had blown drifts across the road, covering everything. There was no way a car could get through. He glanced toward the barn, though he could barely see it through the storm. Daisy was there, waiting. His plan had been to stay through the night, to hope the storm would ease by morning. But Mary was slipping away faster than he thought. He turned back to her. She was breathing harder now, her forehead glistening slightly with sweat. The oxygen machine hummed weakly. Jack checked the generator through the small window. It was still running, but it didn't sound strong anymore. He could feel the panic rising in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. Panic wouldn't help her. She needed him steady. He knelt beside the bed again. "Mary," he whispered, "I'm going to get you out of here. We're going to make it to the highway. Someone will help us." She shook her head weakly. "Jack, no," she whispered. "You can't, the storm—" He squeezed her hand softly. "I can," he said firmly. "I've done harder things. You know me. I won't let the storm take this night away from us." She tried to speak again, but her voice caught in her throat. He brushed a strand of hair from her forehead and smiled gently, trying to give her the strength she no longer had. Jack stood and moved quickly. He grabbed the old leather saddle from the closet. It was the same one they had used for years. He took a thick blanket, wrapped it tight, and put it by the door. He filled a small thermos with warm water and tucked it inside his coat. Every move he made was quiet but sure, like a man who had already made up his mind. He went outside and into the storm again. The wind hit him hard, pushing against his chest, but Jack kept going. Snow reached up to his knees and his boots crunched through it with effort. By the time he reached the barn, his eyelashes were covered in tiny crystals of snow. Daisy stood inside the barn, warm and calm, as if she understood what was happening. Jack ran his hand down her neck. "Good girl," he whispered. "We need you tonight." He placed the saddle on her back, tightened the straps, and threw the blanket over the saddle to make it warmer for Mary. Daisy shifted her weight, but she trusted Jack completely. They had been through many winters together. Jack filled a small pouch with a few medical supplies. Nothing fancy, just what they had. Some water, extra scarves, a flashlight, and a small hand warmer. When everything was ready, Jack led Daisy to the porch. The wind howled around them, swirling snow like dust. He opened the door slowly so the cold wouldn't rush inside too quickly. Mary's eyes were open, following him. Her face was pale and she looked weaker than before. Jack sat beside her again. He spoke softly, but his voice carried the strength of a promise. "We're going now. I won't let anything happen to you. I'll get you to the highway. I'll find help." She tried to protest, but no words came out. Her lips trembled slightly, and a tear slipped from the corner of her eye. Jack wiped it away gently with his thumb. "Don't be afraid," he whispered. "You've always trusted me, haven't you?" She nodded faintly. Jack wrapped her in the thickest quilt they owned. He layered her with scarves and tucked the warm thermos close to her chest. He picked her up carefully, his arms steady. She was lighter than he remembered, and that made his heart ache even more. He opened the door wide. The storm rushed in like a wave, cold and strong, but Jack didn't flinch. He stepped out slowly, holding Mary close. Daisy waited at the bottom of the steps. Jack climbed into the saddle with practiced movements, though the snow made everything harder. He held Mary securely in front of him, wrapping the quilt tightly around both of them. "Hold on to me," he whispered in her ear. She made a small sound, barely audible, but he knew she was listening. He clicked his tongue softly, and Daisy began to move forward. The snow was deep, but Daisy was strong. Each step was slow, deliberate. The wind pushed against them, but Jack held his head low, shielding Mary as best he could. The storm wrapped around them like a wall, but Jack focused on one thing: moving forward. The ranch disappeared behind them quickly, swallowed by the darkness and the snow. Jack kept his eyes fixed on the faint line of trees that led toward the highway. He knew this land like the back of his hand. He had ridden this trail hundreds of times in summer, when the sun was warm and the air smelled like grass. But tonight everything was different. The ground was hidden. The wind erased their path as soon as Daisy stepped through it. Jack spoke softly to Mary as they rode. "Do you remember the summer fields?" he whispered. "The tall grass that brushed against your legs when you walked through it? The sound of the creek behind the barn?" She made a soft sound, maybe a yes, maybe just a breath, but he kept talking. His voice wasn't just for her. It was for him too. It kept him steady, kept him from thinking about the cold pressing against his skin. "You always said this land had a way of holding us," he continued. "Well, tonight we're going to hold on to it too." The wind picked up, stronger than before. Jack could feel it cutting through his coat. His fingers ached, but he didn't loosen his grip on Mary. He leaned forward to keep her as warm as possible, his arms tight around her shoulders. Daisy kept moving, steady and sure. Minutes felt like hours. The highway couldn't be far, but in the storm, distance felt endless. The snow made everything look the same, but Jack followed the faint outline of the fence posts, barely visible in the storm. They guided him forward like old friends showing the way. Mary's head rested against his chest. He could feel the softness of her breath. It was weaker, but it was still there. He whispered her name over and over, not to wake her, but to remind her, and himself, that they were still together. Finally, a faint orange light appeared through the wall of white. Jack narrowed his eyes. It was the highway marker, an old reflector post that caught the light of passing cars. Relief rushed through him, warming him more than any fire could. "We're almost there," he whispered to her. "You hear me, Mary? We're almost there." Daisy pushed through the last stretch of deep snow until her hooves met the edge of the highway. Jack scanned the road. It was nearly empty, but after a few minutes a pair of headlights appeared in the distance, slowly making their way through the storm. Jack lifted his arm, waving it in wide, slow motions. The truck slowed down, its lights cutting through the snow. Jack felt something inside him loosen, a weight he had been carrying since Mary whispered those terrible words hours ago. The truck came to a stop. Jack held Mary closer, whispering, "We made it, sweetheart. We made it." The headlights cut through the storm like a warm light in the darkness. Jack blinked against the blowing snow, hardly believing they had made it to the highway. His arms were stiff from holding Mary. His coat was soaked and his breath came out in thick white clouds. But none of that mattered now. They were no longer alone. The truck rolled to a stop beside them. The sound of its engine was like music in the cold night. A man opened the door and jumped out, his boots crunching on the snow. He was bundled up in a thick jacket, a wool hat pulled down over his ears. His flashlight swept through the blowing snow until it landed on Jack and Mary. "Hey," the man shouted over the wind, his voice full of concern. "Are you folks all right?" Jack didn't have the strength to answer with a long story. His voice was hoarse from the cold, but he managed to say, "She needs help, please." The man ran toward them, his breath visible in the freezing air. When he reached Daisy, he saw Mary wrapped in quilts, her face pale and eyes barely open. "Good Lord," he whispered softly, then raised his voice. "We need to get her warm. There's a clinic down the road, 20 minutes. "Come on," Jack nodded, his heart pounding fast. He held Mary even tighter. Carefully, with the stranger's help, he got off the horse. Daisy stood still, loyal and calm, even as the wind pushed snow around them. Jack carried Mary to the truck. The man threw open the back door, revealing a warm glow from the heater inside. They placed her gently on the seat. Jack climbed in after her, holding her hand as if letting go would make the night fall apart again. The man shut the doors and ran to the driver's seat. Within seconds, the truck was moving slowly through the snow-covered road. Inside, the heater hummed softly. The warmth was a shock after the bitter cold. Jack took off his hat and gloves, his fingers stiff and red. He pulled Mary closer, keeping the quilt around her. Her breathing was shallow, but her eyes flickered open slightly. "You're okay," Jack whispered, his voice soft but strong. "We're on our way, Mary, you hear me? We're on our way." She moved her lips weakly, no sound coming out, but her eyes met his for a brief moment. It was enough. The man glanced in the rearview mirror. "There's a small clinic in town. They've got a nurse there all night because of the storm. We'll get her inside fast," he said. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. He focused on Mary's hand in his, feeling its faint warmth. The wind pounded against the truck windows, but the man drove with steady hands, knowing the road like the back of his hand. For a moment, Jack closed his eyes. He had been awake for hours, every muscle in his body tight from fear and cold. He saw flashes in his mind. Mary's whisper, the storm, Daisy pushing through the snow. And now the warmth of the truck, the stranger's kindness. He let out a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The man's voice broke through the sound of the storm. "Name's Tom," he said. "I've lived out here my whole life. Lucky thing I decided to check the roads tonight. Not many folks out in this weather." Jack managed a tired smile. "Lucky thing," he said softly. Tom looked at Mary through the mirror. "She's a fighter." "I can see it." Jack squeezed her hand gently. "Yes," he whispered. "She is." The truck turned onto the main road leading into town. Streetlights appeared one by one, glowing softly under the falling snow. It was a small town, just a few buildings, a gas station, and a clinic with a dim red sign that flickered through the storm. Tom pulled up right to the door of the clinic. Two nurses were waiting outside, bundled in coats, alerted by Tom's radio call earlier. They opened the door as Tom jumped out. Jack followed, carrying Mary carefully in his arms. The warmth from inside the clinic spilled out into the freezing night. "Get her in here," one of the nurses said urgently but kindly. "We've got her." Jack walked through the doors. The inside of the clinic was small but bright. The smell of clean floors and warm air filled the space. They led him to a room where a narrow bed was waiting. Gently, they helped Jack lay Mary down. The nurses moved quickly but softly, wrapping her in warm blankets, checking her breathing, setting up a small oxygen mask. A monitor beeped quietly. One nurse looked at Jack and gave him a calm smile. "You got her here just in time," she said. "You did good?" Jack stood by the bed, not moving. He didn't know what to do with his hands except hold on to the edge of the blanket, as if holding on would keep her safe. Tom came in behind him, brushing snow off his coat. "They'll take good care of her," he said. She's in good hands now. Jack nodded slowly. His throat felt tight. He wanted to thank Tom, but the words wouldn't come out. Tom simply patted him on the shoulder. "I'll take care of your horse," he said kindly. "She's a fine animal." Jack turned to him finally. "Thank you," he said softly. His voice was rough, but those two words carried all the weight of his heart. Tom nodded and left the room, closing the door quietly behind him. Jack turned back to Mary. Her face was still pale, but there was a softness to it now, as if the storm couldn't touch her anymore. The nurse adjusted the oxygen mask gently. "She's weak," she said softly, "but she's holding on. We'll keep her warm and give her everything she needs." Jack pulled a chair close to the bed and sat down. His hands were shaking from exhaustion and cold. He reached out and held Mary's hand again. This time it felt a little warmer. He brushed his thumb over her knuckles, remembering the countless times her hands had worked alongside his, fixing fences, planting flowers, holding their children. Those hands had built their life together. Hours passed slowly. The storm outside kept blowing, but inside it felt like another world. The lights in the clinic glowed softly. The beeping of the monitor was steady. Jack sat there without moving, his eyes fixed on her chest rising and falling. At one point, a nurse brought him a cup of warm coffee. He held it between his palms, letting the heat soak into his cold fingers. "She's strong," the nurse said gently. "Most people wouldn't have made it this far in that kind of storm. She must really want to live." Jack looked at Mary, and his voice came out as a whisper. "She's the strongest person I know." The nurse smiled and walked away, leaving him alone with Mary. Jack leaned closer to her and whispered softly, "We made it, Mary. You're safe now. You can rest. I'm right here." Her eyes fluttered open just a little, enough for her to see him. She didn't need to speak. The look in her eyes said everything: relief, love, and quiet strength. Jack didn't cry often. He was a man of few words and quiet strength. But that night, sitting by her side, a tear slipped down his cheek, not out of sadness but out of deep, overflowing love. Outside, the storm slowly began to ease. The wind softened and the snow fell more gently. The world was still cold, but it was no longer as fierce. Inside the small clinic, warmth wrapped around them like a soft blanket. Jack leaned back in his chair, still holding her hand. He let himself breathe fully for the first time in hours. He knew the night wasn't over yet. But they had crossed the hardest part. The nurses moved quietly, checking on her, making sure everything was steady. Each soft sound, the monitor, the rustle of blankets, the low hum of the heater, felt like a promise that she was going to make it. As the sky outside began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Jack's head finally rested against the back of the chair. His eyes burned with tiredness, but he didn't close them completely. He didn't want to miss a single breath she took. He whispered one more time, so softly only she could hear. "You're safe now, Mary. We're together. We made it through the night." And for the first time since the storm began, the fear inside him started to melt away. It wasn't gone, but it no longer controlled him. Hope, quiet and steady, filled the room instead. The soft light of morning slipped through the small clinic window, casting a pale golden glow across the room. The storm outside had grown quiet, as if the world had finally taken a deep breath. The snow still covered everything, but it no longer moved with angry winds. Instead, it lay still and silent, shining gently under the early sun. Inside, the air was warm and steady. The heater hummed softly in the corner, and the monitor near Mary's bed beeped in a calm rhythm. Jack sat where he had been all night, in the same chair holding her hand. His shoulders were slouched with exhaustion, but his heart felt lighter than it had in hours. Mary's breathing had changed. It wasn't shallow or uneven anymore. It was slow, calm, and steady, like the quiet rhythm of their home on peaceful evenings. Her cheeks carried a faint blush again, and the softness in her face reminded Jack of how she looked on early spring mornings, sitting on the porch with a cup of tea. One of the nurses walked into the room holding a clipboard. She smiled at Jack kindly. "She's doing better," she said softly, as if speaking too loudly might disturb the gentle peace in the room. "Her oxygen levels are stronger now. The worst is behind her." Jack nodded slowly, his fingers still wrapped around Mary's. "Thank you," he said quietly. It wasn't a grand speech, but it carried the weight of his entire heart. The nurse adjusted the blanket around Mary's shoulders and checked the small machine beside the bed. "She's resting deeply," she said. "That's a good sign. Rest means her body is healing." Jack's eyes stung a little, not from the cold this time, but from the feeling of relief that was slowly washing over him. He had spent the whole night fighting the storm, refusing to let go. Now, for the first time in what felt like forever, he allowed himself to breathe. Mary stirred slightly. Her fingers moved under his hand. Her eyelids fluttered open, not all the way, just enough for her to see him sitting there. Her voice came out like the softest breeze. "Jack." He leaned forward quickly, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "I'm here," he whispered. "Right here, sweetheart." Her lips curved into the smallest smile. "We made it," she whispered back. Jack's throat tightened. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he said softly. "We made it." She blinked, looking around the bright room, then back at him. Her voice was weak but steady. "I thought I wouldn't see the morning." His eyes glistened, but he didn't let the tears fall. He just held her hand a little tighter. "I wasn't going to let that happen," he whispered. "Not as long as I could still stand on my own 2 feet. Mary closed her eyes again, but this time it wasn't out of weakness. It was out of peace. She was safe, warm, alive. And Jack was right there beside her. A little while later, Tom came into the room, brushing snow off his coat. He smiled when he saw Mary awake. "Well, look at that," he said kindly. "You two sure gave this old storm a run for its money." Jack stood and shook his hand firmly. "Tom," he said, his voice filled with quiet gratitude, "I don't know how to thank you." Tom chuckled softly. "No thanks needed, friend. You're the one who got her out of that ranch in the middle of the night. That's not something just anyone could do. You did the hard part. I just drove the truck." Mary turned her head slowly toward him and gave a faint smile. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was still soft, but it carried warmth. Tom tipped his hat gently. "Just glad I was in the right place at the right time." After Tom left, Jack sat back down. He looked at Mary, and for a moment everything else faded away. The storm, the cold, the long night. All he saw was her, his partner, his heart. Hours passed slowly, filled with quiet moments. Nurses came and went, checking on Mary, making sure everything stayed steady. The snow outside sparkled in the bright afternoon sun. The whole town was still and calm, wrapped in a white blanket that made everything look soft and new. Jack didn't leave Mary's side. Every once in a while she would wake up, whisper a few words, then drift back to sleep. Each time she opened her eyes, she found him there, just like he promised. By afternoon, she was strong enough to speak more clearly. "You should rest," she told him softly. Jack chuckled, his voice low. "Rest? After last night, I don't think I could sleep even if I tried. My heart's too full." Mary looked at him for a long moment. Her eyes were still tired, but they shone with that same warmth she had always carried. "You carried me through a storm," she said quietly. "You shouldn't have done that." Jack shook his head slowly. "There was no other way," he said. "You once told me I never give up." "I guess you were right." She reached for his hand. Her fingers were stronger now, the warmth returning to her skin. "I love you," she whispered. Jack smiled softly, and for the first time in what felt like forever, it wasn't a forced smile. It was warm and full, like the sun breaking through the clouds after a long winter. "I love you too," he whispered back. The nurse came in again, smiling. "She's going to need a few days of care," she said gently. "But she's strong. She'll get through this." Jack nodded. He wasn't worried anymore. He knew Mary's strength better than anyone. A few days later, the snow outside began to melt. The roads were cleared and the world felt alive again. Mary was sitting up in bed, her cheeks pink with color, sipping warm tea from a cup Tom had brought her. She looked out the window and smiled at the bright blue sky. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Jack stood beside her, his hands resting lightly on the windowsill. "It is," he agreed softly, "but not as beautiful as seeing you smile again." She turned to him, with that same familiar look she'd given him for more than 40 years, a look that said everything without needing many words. When the day came for her to go home, Jack helped her into the truck carefully, wrapping her in one of the soft quilts from their house. The drive back to the ranch was calm. The world looked different in the daylight. The storm had left everything covered in soft snow, but the sky above was clear and endless. Daisy stood by the barn when they arrived, as if she had been waiting. Jack patted her neck gently. "You did good, girl," he whispered. Mary reached out to stroke the horse's muzzle with a shaky but grateful hand. "She saved me," she said softly. Jack smiled. "We all saved each other," he replied. Inside the house, the fire burned warmly in the stove again. The walls were familiar and safe. The clock ticked gently and the air smelled like home. Jack helped Mary to her favorite chair by the window. She wrapped the quilt around her shoulders and looked out at the field, their field, shining under the sun. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The quiet was full of meaning. Mary finally broke the silence with a soft laugh. "You've always been too stubborn for your own good," Jack chuckled. "And that's why you're still here to tell me that." She leaned her head against the chair and closed her eyes, breathing in the warm air. It wasn't just the warmth of the stove. It was the warmth of love, of home, of a life built together and held strong even in the coldest nights. Jack sat beside her, holding her hand again, the same hand he had held through storms. Through long days, through every season of their lives. He looked at her not with fear anymore, but with quiet joy. She opened her eyes and whispered, "I told you I might not make it through the night." Jack smiled softly, shaking his head. "And I told you," he whispered, "I'd never accept that." Outside, the wind blew gently, not like a storm, but like a soft friend passing by. The ranch stood strong, just like it always had, and in that small house on the edge of the wide Montana land, love proved, once again, that even the coldest night could be warmed by two hearts refusing to let go.